and welcome to Beyond the Knife, a medical history podcast brought to you by Surgeons' Hall, Museums, Library and Archives. We are part of the Royal College of Surgeons of Edinburgh. I am Shantae, Director of Heritage and Estates at the college. Each episode, I'm joined by a guest who shares a story from the history of medicine and surgery. This episode contains discussions on topics that some people may find distressing. Please take care while listening. Step into the narrow, cobbled streets of 16th century Edinburgh, where a curious figure worked at the crossroads of grooming and medicine, the barber surgeon. Beneath the swirl of red and white poles symbolizing blood and bandages, these practitioners offered haircuts, tooth extractions, and rudimentary surgery, serving as both barbers and healers. In July 1505, a pivotal moment arrived. The city's barber surgeons were formally united under a seal of cause granted by the town council. This charter laid the foundation for what would grow into the Royal College of Surgeons of Edinburgh, now the oldest surgical institution in the world. But what did those early days look like? What tools, beliefs, and customs shaped the profession in its infancy? To help us uncover the gritty, fascinating roots of surgery in Edinburgh, we're joined by Thomas Elliott, the head of Surgeons' Hall Museums here at the Royal College of Surgeons of Edinburgh. Welcome to the podcast, Thomas.
Thank you.
So we're going to start off with the warm-up question that we put to all of our guests. If you could be present at any moment in the history of medicine, what would it be and why?
Well, I think the one I'm thinking of is really to do is medical science, shall we say. I would go back to the middle of the 20th century, 1953, and the discovery of the structure of DNA with the double helix. Simply because I think it's so fundamental, the idea that we understand the makeup of all living things, not just humans, but animals, plants, and all the amazing ramifications that have come from that since, in gene therapy and forensics and, just our understanding of what makes us us.
That's a great answer. So tell us about that moment of discovery. Who was there?
So it was two scientists in Cambridge, Watson and Crick, who made this discovery. But what I love about the story is it's got a bit of drama, it's got a bit of politics in it, because there was also a laboratory in London in King's College that were working on the same issue. They all knew about one another, and it kind of always reminds me of the space race a decade later, where the Americans or the Russians going to be the first one on the moon. And it was a similar idea that these two labs, very renowned labs, were all working at the same time but independently, and it was a race to the finish to see who could discover it first.
And when they discovered it, did they tell the other lab immediately?
Yes, they were very well aware of how close they were getting, and subsequently when the Nobel Prize was given out for that discovery, it was Watson and Crick that got it, but a chap called Wilkins from the London lab was a co-recipient of it.
Oh.
So.
That's brilliant.
Yeah.
So, Thomas, you and I work at the Royal College of Surgeons of Edinburgh, which was founded in 1505, and today we are talking about the barber surgeons. So take us back to that year, what the world of surgery looked like, or the world of surgery and barbery, rather, and why these two professions were linked.
Well, back at that time, obviously there were surgeons doing the basic surgery that was available at that point. There were barbers cutting hair and shaving. I guess they both used similar instruments, sharp instruments. And so it would make sense in that regard to combine. So in 1505, they came together as what was known as the Incorporation of Surgeons and Barbers of Edinburgh. They approached the town council, and it was really formal recognition as a medieval trade guild, essentially, in a similar way to you'd have groups of carpenters or groups of stonemasons coming together. And it was, I guess, public recognition of that being a professional guild, as it was known at the time.
It's such a fascinating idea of a completely different approach to the human body, because I guess when we think about everything we know about the body today, the idea that your hair and what is inside you could be dealt with in the same way is just wild. But at that time, I guess, it's all, the understanding is sort of similar.
It is. And also, if you bear in mind as well that this was not seen as an academic pursuit. Nowadays, we think of a surgeon as, the pinnacle of your medical career. You've gone through years of university and so on. Back in those days, similar to all the other trade guilds, you learned as an apprentice. You learned very much on the job, and it was seen in that way. So each of these trade guilds would have a founding document that became known as the Seal of Cause.
The Seal of Cause, tell us about that.
Yeah, so each trade guild would have their own Seal of Cause, but for the surgeons and barbers, I find it a fascinating document. What it does is it really outlines both the privileges associated with becoming a member of the incorporation and the responsibilities associated with that. So in terms of the privileges, essentially it set up a monopoly. So if you were a surgeon or a barber in the city of Edinburgh at that point, to be allowed to practice, you had to become a member of that incorporation. And some of the key concepts in the Seal of Cause are still as relevant today as they were 500 years ago, whereas there's some real fun, quirky elements that have been lost in time.
The quirky ones?
The quirky ones, starting with the quirky ones. Okay. So one of the ones was that in addition to the monopoly that I mentioned, the surgeon barbers had the sole right to make or create and sell whisky in the city at the time. So that was lost when the barbers and surgeons a couple of centuries later split up.
Man.
But I always think...
We should have retained that to this day, huh?
I do think if we'd retained that, I think we'd all be on to a winner. We would be a very much richer organisation if we were the only ones allowed to sell whisky in the city of Edinburgh.
So privileges, yes, and then responsibilities.
Yes, and the key one obviously is around this idea of competence. If you're going to set yourself up in any trade, but particularly in surgery, then you have to demonstrate competence in some way. So it's written down formally, and it stipulates in this document that every member should be worthy and expert in all subjects of the crafts. It then goes on to add that to show this, that each member should be diligently and knowledgeably examined, which I think is really quite telling, that it's put down in writing that there should be some kind of examination. And obviously, a person training to be a surgeon nowadays will go through a lot more rigorous exams than 500 years ago, but nonetheless, that stipulation was there.
It's such a fascinating question of why this institution has lasted over 500 years. And one of the theories that I've heard people talk about is because that setting up of the Seal of Cause is still relevant, well, apart from the quirky bits, many of them are still relevant to this day. So that idea around standards and examination for surgery is, of course, still relevant today.
Absolutely, absolutely. If, whether it was 500 years ago or 1,000 years ago or today, if you want to be operating on a person, then you would be very much hoping that you knew what you were doing. And that was the essence, and that remains with us 500 years later.
So let's say I become a member of this trade guild. Am I always being both a barber and surgeon together, or could I practice those separately?
In the very early days, very often you would do both jobs. But in practice, by the end of the 1500s, there was a distinction made between the surgeons and the barbers, what were then referred to as the simple barbers. So they were essentially destined to be limited to shaving and cutting hair, and the surgeons would be the ones involved in what we'd consider, procedures or operations.
So in those early days, so before that distinction came about, what kind of treatments are the barber surgeons doing? And I guess also, how did they decide what to do? How did they diagnose?
Well, there's another distinction then to be drawn, because we had the physicians, the doctors, working alongside the surgeons in effect, and it would be the physicians that primarily would be doing the diagnosing. They would speak to their patients, they would maybe listen to their chest, they would examine their urine, they would consult astrology charts, all of this to come to some kind of diagnosis. But when it came to treating the illness, then that area was left primarily to the surgeons. There were surgical and non-surgical, I suppose, treatments available. So one of the big theories that surrounded all ideas of illness that dates back to ancient Greece was this notion of the four humours. And in effect, that was a theory based on balance. So the four humours were fluids inside the body, which consisted of blood, bile, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. And the idea was that those four fluids had to remain in balance to maintain health. If for any reason they went out of balance, then that's what caused illness or disease. And so, it was a mix of things like diet. The physician might just recommend a new dietary regime to help. It may be that to remove excess of any one of these humours, you'd be given essentially a poison, something like hellebore, that would induce vomiting, or it might induce diarrhea. And so that would then purge the body of some of these humours. But the surgical option, if you want to call it that was available, and by far the most common procedure that a barber surgeon would be involved in, would be bloodletting. And bloodletting relied on that key concept of the four humours, but it also relied on the extent of our knowledge about blood at the time. So yes, bloodletting was based around two key concepts. The notion that I've just mentioned about fluids being in balance with this theory of the four humours, but also it was guided by what we knew about blood in the body at the time. At that time, we had no idea that the blood circulates, pumped through the body by a heart. And the most common idea was that somehow the blood was created. It didn't circulate, but it was used up by the body in some mysterious way, and it might stagnate at the extremities, and new blood would have to be produced. So bloodletting was seen as a common way to restore that balance by either removing excess blood in the right circumstances. And the practice itself was pretty basic. You had a bowl that had a small curved groove cut in it that the patient would typically rest their forearm on, and then the surgeon would use what looked like a small penknife. It was known as a fleam, and they'd make a small nick in the arm, either around the wrist or the elbow, and they'd drain a certain amount of blood.
I have so many questions. So was that idea that then you had too much blood, so some had to come out? Okay, so imbalance. The bit about this would generate better blood, new blood?
No, the bloodletting wouldn't be seen as a way, but it might remove blood that was in some way deficient.
Right, okay.
It may be too hot, it may be too cold, it may be there's just a simple excess of blood in the body.
What am I? I've gone to see my barber surgeon. My hand is over the bowl. I'm bleeding into it. I just sit there for a certain amount of time. What does the treatment look like?
You sit there and it wouldn't. I guess it wouldn't be especially painful.
Okay.
It was just a small nick. The problem with it was the amounts. So in a typical session, they might take out somewhere close to a pint of blood from your body. Now, if you're already feeling weak or ill and you have some serious illness, draining blood is not really going to do you much good at all. And sometimes the patient would be repeatedly drained, a few bloodletting sessions over the course of several days. So they would just become in an increasingly weakened state.
So it certainly wasn't a treatment that helped.
No, I don't think it done much in the way of help.
What about leeches? Did they use those as well?
That was basically another method of doing the same thing. So bloodletting could be used by cutting with a small knife, or it could be leeches would be attached to the arm, and they would obviously do the job of the knife and suck out the excess blood.
And at what date did people become aware that bloodletting wasn't a great idea?
Well, what I find fascinating is it persisted for centuries. Now, there's a medical textbook that was published in the 1920s, believe it or not, that mentions bloodletting. It doesn't use it as a cure-all in the way it did back in the 1500s, where it was used to treat all manner of illnesses, headaches, anemia, fevers, anything almost that really was a catch-all. And certainly in the 19th century, I think most medical practitioners were at the very least beginning to question the value of it. But one interesting thing I think happened was it was almost led by patient demand. And the analogy I always use is, in the modern day, if I'm feeling a bit low, I'm laid low with a cold or a flu, and I go to the doctor, and the doctor quite rightly says, go home, rest, drink fluids, you sometimes feel a little cheated, and it's like, oh, but I need antibiotics, or I need this treatment or a tablet or something. In similar ways in the 19th century, I think patients felt that if they went to a surgeon and they didn't have any recognisable treatment, such as a bloodletting, they would think, oh, this person doesn't know what they're doing.
Clearly, I need to have some of this bloodlet.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, so bloodletting aside, what else? What else is the barber surgeon doing?
Well, I mean, I think maybe the obvious point to make at that point is surgery is very, very basic. For the patient, it would often involve a good deal of pain, and it was also very dangerous. And both the surgeons and the patients knew how dangerous it was. So it was really done as a last resort. It wasn't a go-to thing. But very simple things like setting fractures, lancing boils, maybe trying to remove a growth on the surface of the skin, something like a wart, that would all be considered part of the job. But the other big, the most common procedure, I guess, as well as bloodletting, would be something that we maybe don't normally associate with surgery, but it is part of it and has been since day one, and it's around the idea of dentistry, where early barber surgeons would be removing rotten teeth. In the days where we had no other option, if you had rotten teeth, we all know how horrendous toothache can be. The only option available is to take it out. So they would use what were known as tooth keys, or sometimes pelicans, and they were horrendous looking instruments, almost like a set of pliers, but with a hinged claw on the end that would hook over a tooth, and the surgeon barber would just yank it out with no pain relief.
So quite a lot of physical force required there.
A good deal of physical force, and not very pleasant at all for the patient.
So it wasn't a good time to be sick?
Not at all, not at all.
What about the barber pole? There's a story around that?
Yes, so the red and white pole that we associate with barber shops in the UK comes from that period where it was a form of advertising. You would set up shop in one of the narrow streets in the old town of Edinburgh, or any other city for that matter, and after you had maybe dressed a wound from a patient, you would wrap it in the bandage, you would then clean the wound, and that bandage, if you were lucky, might have a quick rinse in water. It would be hung outside the shop over this pole, and the wind would proceed to wrap it round. So this blooded bandage became a common sight, I guess, and it's still there in the symbolism of the red and the white of the barber's pole that we see today.
I like when you say, if you were lucky, the bandage was washed and hung out.
Yes.
That's what good looked like.
Yeah.
Fantastic. So what about at that point, were there any moments in that early history of surgery that felt ahead of their time? So any attempts to kind of push the limits of what surgery could discover?
Yeah, I think there's some procedures that might surprise everyone, that they were done at such an early stage, even before we were founded in 1505. So one of them, trephination, or trephining as it's known, involves the cutting of a hole in the skull in some way. And this has been known since ancient times. There have been skeletons found in archaeological burial sites that have been dated to be 7,000 years old, believe it or not, with this distinctive circular hole. Now, if you consider that 7,000 years ago, we were in the Stone Age, we didn't have metal instruments, so the archaeologists have surmised that these holes would be made by scraping with sharp bits of flint, which just sounds horrendous.
So horrendous. With
no pain relief. But the thing I found most astounding about trephination is there is some evidence that people survived it. There's evidence of new bone growth around some of these wounds in these archaeological sites, which suggests that a patient survived.
So why trephination? What does it do?
We think that in the very early days, it was very often associated with some kind of ritualistic thing rather than a medical procedure. But it would be used certainly in battlefield surgery to relieve pressure on the brain. If you got something like a depressed fracture in the skull, then that skull obviously is pressing down the brain and is very dangerous. So they would have to remove those fragments. And so it was used in those kind of ways. Through the Middle Ages, it was used because medicine was mixed up with superstition and astrology and so on. So it was the idea of releasing evil spirits from the body, from the head. Trephination might sometimes be used for that. But it's still used today in a modern form, very much for that notion of relieving pressure. So if you have a depressed fracture, then a surgeon may well use a modern version of trephination to relieve that pressure.
And the Barber surgeons were doing trephination?
They would do, yeah, when required. As I say, this would not be an everyday occurrence, but it was part of their armoury, if you want to look at it that way. The other one that dates way back is the notion of cataract surgery. And when I first heard this, when I started here many years ago, it just appalled me of the idea. But cataract surgery was written about in India in around 800 BCE. So, nearly 2,000 years ago, or more than 2,000 years ago now.
Wow.
We know it was practiced in ancient Rome, and it was known as couching. And really all that could be done would be they would use sharp instruments, sharp implements to push away the cloudy lens in the eye, and it would either be pushed to the back of the eye or pushed down to the bottom of the eye. So it would result in improvement in sight for the person, but it certainly wouldn't restore, functional vision. You wouldn't have a functional lens to focus, but you would see light and dark, and you'd end up with blurred vision. There's very little records of how successful that was. But yeah, in ancient Egypt, for example, there have been reeds. They used reeds that were adapted. So there was that element of at least trying to achieve surgical precision. It wasn't just sticking any old reed in your eye. There was an element of precision.
Than just sticking any old reed in your eye. It's so interesting to think about all the specialisms that we have today. So we have talked about ophthalmology, dentistry, I guess general surgery, and of course being a barber, so hair cutting, and all of those would group together.
Yeah. There was one fascinating example of pushing limits that took place in the late 1500s in Italy, and it was around the idea of plastic surgery. Rhinoplasty, essentially a nose job. At that time, people were duelling, and there was a lot of wounds associated with the nose, noses getting sliced off and such like. And an Italian surgeon, Gaspare Tagliacozzi, in 1597, published the first ever book devoted entirely to the subject of plastic surgery. So we think of plastic surgery as a very modern innovation, but in 1597, Tagliacozzi, in his book, was describing methods of repairing and reconstructing noses that had been injured in duels. The book was called On the Surgical Restoration of Defects by Grafting, and the technique just sounds bizarre in the extreme. So the actual technique, as described by Tagliacozzi in his book, involved taking a graft from the patient's upper arm and attaching it to the nose. So this poor patient would have their arm bound to the face, essentially for periods of weeks or months.
So they actually sewed the arm to the nose?
They would indeed, to allow the blood to then take, as it were, to create this new flesh in a very basic grafting technique.
That makes bloodletting look good.
Yeah, it does. And again, there's not an awful lot of information on the success of this. But just the fact that someone had the foresight to think about this as even a concept, I find astounding at such an early date.
You're absolutely right, that it is incredible, and the idea that this would work and the principles of it are absolutely accurate. I just keep thinking about the poor patients who first of all lost the duel, I'm guessing, or the joust, or perhaps one, and then have their arms sewn to their nose.
That's right, yeah. And there was probably an earlier technique. So this became known as the Italian method. And in Western Europe, certainly, that was seen as the way to do it. So in the early part of the 19th century, as the British Empire expanded, news came back from India, from an English doctor, of techniques that he had heard about, written about in India, and it then becomes known as the Indian method. And this dates back to Sanskrit writings, again in that period, 800 BC. They were described, doesn't tell us how successful they were, but the Indian method differed, whereby they would take a flap of skin from the forehead and cut and twist and stitch it onto the nose area. So there were two different methods of doing a nose job.
Wow, and it's still attached to your forehead and then just stitched down.
Yeah.
Incredible. What about in the collection here, Thomas? There are a lot of kidney stones, I know, from that early period.
Yes, kidney stones is an interesting one. They had a name for that, and they literally called it cutting for the stone. And interestingly, that procedure is mentioned in the Hippocratic Oath, way back in ancient Greece, whereby in the Hippocratic Oath it states, "I will not cut for stone, even for patients in which the disease is manifest. I will leave this operation to be performed by practitioners, specialists in their art." Now, if you think this is written by Hippocrates, who was a physician, so what he's essentially saying is doctors should not get involved in the art of surgery. Doctors are there to diagnose, surgeons are there to treat and to operate.
Gosh, so that distinction between that practical skill of the barber surgeon and the physician goes all the way back to Hippocrates. Incredible. So despite all of this knowledge and this understanding we're developing an understanding of anatomy, we're developing an understanding of biology, things are progressing throughout this time, it does feel like surgical process is pretty painfully slow. What were the major forces holding us back?
I guess I would say there are three key things in surgery at that time that we have to overcome to allow it to advance and to push forward. And the three problems, as they were, was the idea of pain, the idea of blood loss, and this idea, critically, is infection. And all of these were known issues. The problem was we didn't know how to go about solving them. We didn't understand the underlying theory of it. So by the early 1600s, for example, I mentioned earlier, at one point we thought that blood was produced probably in the liver. It's then used up in the body and the liver's constantly replenishing it, and we're bloodletting. But by 1628, William Harvey comes along and he publishes a very famous book, De Motu Cordis, and for the first time he accurately describes the circulation of the blood within the body. It's a closed system. The heart is pumping blood around the body. It's returning to the heart via lungs to pick up oxygen and so on. So that was a huge advance in knowledge. But unless you can, you first have to understand what goes wrong before you can then figure out a way to treat it. But the figuring out a way to treat it is often lags well behind the anatomical knowledge. So that's just one example where we were using microscopes, for example, a little bit later in the early 1700s, even in the late 1600s. So most famous person of all, Antony van Leeuwenhoek, he is identifying bacteria for the first time. We can see them, these microscopic organisms. He called them animalcules, but nonetheless, he would identify sperm cells, things like that. So the knowledge we were gaining was coming at a rate of knots, but treatment, sadly, always lags behind. And if you think about it now, when we're developing vaccines, we've got to understand how a virus works, how it replicates itself, before we can then figure out a way to stop that from happening.
You mentioned as well pain, which of course was a significant challenge. So, I mean, of all the treatments that you've discussed with us today, I have screwed up my face in so many different expressions because, my gosh, they sound so painful. And that must have been such a limiting factor, how much a patient could actually stand.
Absolutely. And really, moving forward, it took until the 19th century until what began to develop as surgery as we would see it as being acceptable happened. And the first big breakthrough was with pain relief, where in the 1840s dentists in America start using ether as anaesthetic. And here in Edinburgh, famously, James Young Simpson comes along a few years later and is the first person to use chloroform. So pain relief was a massive boon to patients. Obviously, they're no longer screaming and kicking on the operating table. But interestingly, it didn't make it any safer for patients. It just made it bearable. And really, the big game changer came in the 1860s with Joseph Lister's properly groundbreaking work on antiseptic techniques, this ability to deal with infection. And initially, it was killing infection using weak acid solutions, but then that very naturally leads to trying to prevent infection in the first place with sterilising equipment. But you can almost date modern surgery from 1867 when Lister publishes his paper on antiseptic principles in surgery. And all the amazing things we do now with transplants, with artificial hips, or whatever, you name it, all relies on the ability to control infection. Until we can do that, then those days of Barber surgeons, that's why it was essentially limited to external work. The idea, we all knew how dangerous going inside the body was, so we didn't do it. So
1867, we have that change in surgical practice, which is so significant. Going back, so we've got the Barber surgeons forming their guild in 1505. By the end of the 1500s, we see the split with the simple barber. So is it really from about the 1600s onwards? How long did the barber surgeons survive for?
The barber surgeons here in Edinburgh didn't legally separate until 1722. So, there was that period of over 100 years where essentially it was two separate crafts in practice, but the legal separation took a good deal longer. And so post 1722, we then become the Incorporation of Surgeons of Edinburgh, and over the centuries change their name a couple of times and become a Royal College of Surgeons. But it's the same organisation in continuous existence for over 500 years now.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for joining us, Thomas.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Beyond the Knife, a medical history podcast brought to you by Surgeons Hall Museums, Library and Archives. To find out more about us, you can visit www.museum.rcsed.ac.uk. You can also follow us on our social media channels. Join us wherever you get your podcasts.